Kathy.
I'm the speaker. Yep. Do we wait any longer, or can we really start?
We can probably start. I'll start just by saying thanks for coming. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name's Laura Dumahovsky. I'm the Media Services Librarian here. I want to thank our wonderful committee, and I would also like to thank the Friends for sponsoring the event. If you haven't gotten a cookie or a beverage, do so now. And if you have not signed up to win the door prize for today, please do that as well. Just put your name on a piece of paper, put it in a little bucket.
What is the door prize?
Today's prize, I'm so glad you asked, Richard. Today's prize is a $10 gift card to Eaton Cafe.
Oh, well, perfect. I go there all.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Chris. Chris is the Vice President and Senior Financial Advisor with Merrill Lynch Wealth Management in Batavia. He began his career in the financial services industry in 1992 and joined Merrill in 2008, where he is partner in RGR WT and Associates. He has achieved a Chartered Retirement Planning Counselor Professional designation awarded by the College of Financial Planning. In addition to his work helping individuals, nonprofits, foundations, and trusts efficiently grow, preserve, and distribute their wealth, Chris is very involved in giving back to his community. Having served in leadership roles on boards for many organizations, including GLOW, YMCA, United Memorial Medical Center Foundation, United Way, and Leadership Genesee. Chris is a 10-plus year member of the Batavia Rotary Club and a member of multiple Paul Harris Award recipient for outstanding contributions to Rotary and its community. Chris and his wife Gina live in Batavia. They have 2 grown daughters, Taylor and Madison, a very spoiled dog and an equally spoiled granddog. And Chris will be reviewing for us today Ponzi scheme, the true story of a financial legend. And we've known about Ponzi schemes for ages, but where did that come from? We're going to find out.
I hope to answer that. Thank you, Pat. That's very nice. 1992 started. This just means that I'm old. So thank everybody for coming today. And thanks to Kathy for strong-arming me into doing this, asking the financial guy to talk about Ponzi schemes and scams. So, and when she first had asked me, I said, no, I can't. I'm busy. I can't. Trying to get a book read in between everything else, and summers. But when I got the book, I actually found itself, it was a very easy read, something that I continue to go back to when I read it much quicker than I had thought that I would as I got through it. It has been a long time since I have taken notes, having to read a book to do a presentation. But I found the book itself very easy to read. So as Kathy said, the book is Ponzi Scheme, True Story of a Financial Legend, which is, I think, can go either way in terms of describing the individual. It was written by Mitchell Zuckoff, and Mitchell has written a few other books. This book came out in 2005. He's written a few other books. He's a professor of journalism at Boston University. He worked for the Boston Post, I believe, as an investigative journalist. So some of the other books that he has written talk about the true story of 9/11, Benghazi, the heroes of WW2, and a book that I thought was kind of out of the ordinary, a historical book on Robert Altman, who's one of the writers for the original MASH from that. So very interesting in terms of the book. It's about 400 pages. The thing that I found interesting at the end, there's about 55 pages of reference materials. So I'll talk a little bit about the style, what I found here in terms of the book, the writing style. But it was good in terms of the references. You could tell that there was a lot of work that was done in terms of the way that this book was written as I kind of get into that. Historical context. So, how many, I'm thinking everybody has everybody heard of Ponzi scheme? Kind of know what a Ponzi scheme is? I don't have any takers on giving me $100 today, and I'll be back in 45 days? No. So, therein lies the financial legend. Everybody down there is familiar with the term Ponzi scheme, but nobody really knows where that kind of came from. So in terms of the historical, this book takes place in the 1920s, the early 1920s, late 1919. Itself takes place in Boston, in the South Boston, heavily immigrant area of Boston. His background, to kind of give you a sense for what was going on in the 20s at that time. So this was pre-depression, this was pre-crash, 1929. This was almost the Wild West in terms of banks, regulations. The government was still trying to figure out how to monetize or how to govern things. You had a large influx of immigrants at the time that were coming in. America was seen as the land of opportunity. The streets were paved in gold and all of that. And Mitchell, I think, does a good job of kind of culling that together. In 1920, anything seemed possible, especially when it came to money. A new ethos was emerging, one that would reshape what it meant to be an American. No more pennies saved and pennies earned. Money was best when it arrived fast, easy, and in large quantities. Newspapers fueled dreams of prosperity with stories of poor girls marrying rich men, inherited fortunes from long-lost relatives, and fearless entrepreneurs who'd hit it big. The message was clear. No longer was prosperity the preserve of the well-born. Even the laborer and the charwoman could aspire to the manor. All it took was the right break, the right knock at the door, and if wealth does not come knocking, go get it yourself. Plunge into dark waters in pursuit of sunken treasure, never mind the shallow bottoms. For promoters of instant assets, it was a time when it paid to think big. But at the same time, in the same city, a smiling, cane-twirling, banty rooster of a man had a better idea for doubling money. A secret formula for financial alchemy that could transform penny stamps into millions of dollars. Admirers hailed him as a wizard, critics branded him as a fraud. Either way, he arrived at the scene at the perfect moment. His amazing run would mark the first roar in the 20s, and his name would live on forever. So that's in the prologue of the book. That kind of sets the time frame, the period from that. So who was Ponzi? So Ponzi was born Carlo Ponzi in 1882 in Italy. The only son of a respected family. His father was a postmaster at the time. His mother actually had more social status than his father at the time through her family. A lot of her family, aunts, uncles, grandparents had names given to them in terms of they were doms or they had titles. So the family had fallen on some hard times, but they were still a respected family. And Carlo was the only son of the family and was doted on as an only child would. Mother spent a lot of times early on. Mitchell refers to a lot of times where the mother is spending time kind of instilling in him the sense of returning the family's name to good fortune. So throughout the book, there's this theme regarding you're wondering why would he do some of these things, as I'll talk about here in a second. Why would he do some of these things? And it kind of comes back a little bit to his upbringing and his mother's reliance on him to try and bring the family's name back to back to its title status that it had before. It'll also talk a little bit about always trying to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Through his actions, he was ashamed of some of the things that he had done, and knew that he had caused his mother disappointment. His father had passed away when they sent him to a revered boarding school. And the book itself, outside of his time period in college, doesn't talk a lot about his upbringing in terms of when he was younger. It does make a couple of points. His family scraped, sent him to a private boarding school. His father passed away while he was at boarding school, but during there, he impressed a lot of the teachers. He obviously spoke fluent Italian, but he also learned how to speak French at that time, and was very well regarded by the instructors that were there. His father had passed away. His mother was still alive, living at home. She was, providing him some support. He received a small inheritance from his father, from his uncle, and that afforded him the opportunity to go to university. Whether it was his upbringing, or whether it was his mindset that he wasn't satisfied with who he was as an individual, the 4 years that he spent there were not time spent. Mitchell uses the term, Zuckoff uses the term Roman holiday. He basically went to school for 4 years, got in with a crowd who had the money, who had the status, who liked going out, who liked buying new clothes, who liked spending money, and Ponzi kind of gravitated towards that crew. He didn't have the wherewithal in order to do that, and after a few years, essentially he dropped out. This kind of became the first disappointment for him. This is kind of laying out, his idea of always trying to come up with a way to save face, to save the family, to make sure that his mom was not ashamed of him, that he could bring reputation back to the family. She had told him, things of always always trying to instill in him a sense where he was a little bit of a better person. Without the financial backing, he had to drop out of school. He came back home and started doing menial jobs. Throughout this time, as the book was written, and I'll talk about this in a second, but as the book was written, this is kind of the precursor up until the beginning of when this scheme gets in motion. So he spends time doing menial jobs, he bounces around, and then at the age of 28, he decides that he has passage on a ship leaving Italy, heading towards Boston. His family has arranged for him to spend some time with a distant relative in Pittsburgh. He comes over to the United States, believes is looking for the land of opportunity with the streets paved in gold, and he makes mention in the passage in here that all he finds is mud, and his splats get dirty as he walks off the gangplank to get into Boston. So kind of the harsh reality of America. He decides to go to Pittsburgh to be with his family and do some menial jobs there. He realizes that this is not what he's interested in doing, and so this is when he starts trying to take some other jobs. He eventually ends up in Montreal, working for, and this is kind of with the beginning of setting in motion what will become the scheme. Works for an individual called Luigi Zuckoff up in Montreal, who owns a bank called Zuckoff Bank. Zuckoff Bank, I'm sorry. Let me review my notes immigrants here. Zuckoff Bank, Luigi Zuckoff, who is working heavily with the Italian immigrants in Montreal, providing funding, savings, and then sending money back to Italy. Ponzi himself is very outgoing, very gregarious, very personable. To have a scheme like this work, you have to be trustworthy, whether it's in presentation, whether it's in speech, and he had that. He was very easily, he was easy to make friends, easy to talk with others, and through some menial positions, whether it was in Montreal to start, basically walked into the bank unannounced. They hired him, and then he had moved up into a position after a few months, moved up into a position of a manager. And he was able to kind of work his way through his charisma into bigger and better positions. As he was there, the owner of the bank, he realized that the owner of the bank at the time, Luigi, was promising greater rates of return on money than what the other banks in the area were providing. Where if you made a deposit, rather than paying 3%, as the other banks were paying, he would offer 6%. And through Ponzi, it became clear that after a while, he wasn't raising enough money in order to do that. And so what Zuckoff did was he was actually taking money from deposits that were made that were hoped to go back to Italy. He was found out. They closed the bank. Zuckoff escaped. Ponzi, was charged with, at that time, was investigated, cleared, but at that time, realizing that he had no cash, he went into an office of an associate of the bank, stole a check, forged it, cashed it, and then got caught. Spent the money on fine clothes, dinners, his first foray into stealing, essentially. Spends about a couple of years in prison in Montreal. Zuckoff introduces a number of characters as he's through in kind of this development stage of Ponzi. Because in there, and I think it leads, he's presenting the option, or the image that there are a number of individuals who had a compelling effect, or had an effect on Ponzi at that time. So in there, so he meets Zuckoff, who is essentially borrowing money, kind of the robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. While in prison, he meets a gentleman who was trying to corner the ice market, who was paying off people, paying off the mayors, paying off the politicians in order to kind of corner the ice market. He was in jail. He was a multimillionaire. He left. He met a few other individuals at this time that it seemed everyone he was meeting or he was putting in front was trying to manipulate the system. So perhaps in his mind he thought this is the way things work in America. But during this time, so he spends his time in Montreal. In prison, he gets out of prison, and then he's caught with 5 Italian immigrants coming back from Montreal. He actually spent time in the jail in Plattsburgh, which I thought was interesting, kind of a local, close to New York. Spent some time there and decided this wasn't working out. Got transferred to a federal detention facility in Atlanta. During this entire time, Ponzi is trying to figure out a way to make it big. How do I make money? How do I make this? So they were talking stories that he would spend time at the boarding house, or he would spend time trying to develop ways that he can make money. How can I not really manipulate the system, but what's the way to make a quick buck? And with there were some quotes in here regarding the amount of time that he had spent trying to figure out a way to make a quick buck. And during this time, through one of his business opportunities, he came across something that's called a international reply coupon. He discovered that there was that an international reply coupon is a piece of paper that will allow, it's kind of like think of it in terms of a money order, purchased in local currency. So in Italy, they would purchase it in the local currency. They're in the lira. And it was agreed this is how much you can convert it into US dollars for. One of his other positions at that time is he had gotten involved with a company called J.R. Poole, and they were international traders. So he learned a little bit about foreign currency fluctuations at that time. So coupled with this international reply coupon that kind of came in off the side, off a business that he was closing down, and his knowledge regarding the fluctuations playing the currency markets and the fluctuations in the currency, he came upon this idea where he could purchase these international reply coupons in foreign currencies, play the arbitrage, play the fluctuation in terms of the dollars, buy them in the US dollars, make the money, and realize what he thought was free money at that time, free cash, a way to make 30, 40, 50% on his money. Problem is he needed somebody to do that because he didn't have the money. So that kind of lays out the framework or the basis for the scheme. The scheme starts 1919, he decides to open a company called the Securities and Exchange Company in Boston. He has a little office upstairs in a side street in Boston, hangs a shingle out in front with his idea that he thinks is going to work. He's sure it's going to work. He knows this is what's going to provide him to make this money, to bring his mother over, to tell her, to tell her that he's made it, he's successful. But he needs to get access to money, so he goes out and he starts talking to individuals, people that he knows in the community, the gentleman that he's renting furniture from for the office. He talks to him, he talks to the guy at the supermarket, and during, he talks to other people on the street, trying to get the word out. The idea at this time, which was not a completely new idea because it had been done probably 50, 60 years before in some different fashions. So the concept itself was not new, but the means by which he was explaining how he would go about making this money was unique. So he needed the capital in order to do that. And therein lies people would give him money, he would promise, he would write them a slip, a little note, and he would promise that in 45 days, he would get 50% back. If they kept it for 90 days, it would double their money. So if somebody brought in $100, he would pay him 45 days, they presented, they would give him $150. So the idea at this time was, I'm going to get this capital and I'm going to try this out. I'm going to try this and see how it works, work the kinks out. But when the first money started coming in, and I think that Zuckoff does it, he does a good job of explaining, there's kind of these two, you have the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. The angel, and I had the excerpt in here and I was going to read it, but essentially what it was going to do is he realized at the time, as Zuckoff was saying, he realized at the time he's got this first money of an investor that's given him money that he's promised in order so that he can try and do this. So the angel on one hand is like, okay, let's take his money, let's see how this will work out. Let's see if, but I've got these things to work out. How am I gonna get these coupons? How am I gonna find somebody outside overseas in order to buy them for me? How am I gonna convert them into cash? How am I gonna do all these things? He was a big picture guy, not very strong on details. So the idea was, I've got this great idea, I just have to figure out how to do this. The devil, on the other hand, was, well, what you could do is you could just take the money, continue to advertise it, accumulate more and more money, and then when you get enough money, kind of scram and go back to Italy. Take your new wife, go back to Italy with your money, and run away and hope never to get caught. So, in Ponzi's mind here, as I got kind of, as you're going through the book, in his mind, he knew he was being deceitful, but he didn't think that he was being deceitful. There's kind of this gray area that he's walking at down the middle of this. So he decides, I'm going to kind of play the middle. I know that it's not the right thing, but if I can accumulate enough money to work out some of these kinks, then I'll be able to realize this money, I'll be able to get these investors, I can make this money, show that it works, and I'll have this fame and fortune that he has been striving for. It started to explode. The idea, so word of mouth, and he realized that the best salespeople for telling others were some of his first investors. Some of the first people that gave him money were the best salespeople for him. He did hire a couple of other salespeople also that went out, and they would ask you for money. Hey, I got this great idea. You should see this guy down the street. He's going to pay you 50% on your money in 45 days. And what Ponzi would do is he would pay them 10% as a commission of the money that they brought in. He thought that if he got enough money, he could work the kinks out and get this going, but the money was coming in. And so he opened the business in the beginning of 1920. By March, he had 110 investors. He had $25,000. April, he had $140,000 was deposited with him in April. Now, this is in the early 1920s. This was when the average salary was $2,000 a year. The president of Harvard was making $6,000 a year. And people, as he's going through, he's assigning, Zuckoff is assigning names to some of these people that go in to see him. And the first thing, as I'm going through this, I'm realizing, well, you know, I'm reading these names and there's not a contextual point to this. I'm never going to read this name again. I don't care about this gentleman who's the grocer down the street. I'm not going to. Well, what he's doing is he's personalizing these individuals, telling as Zuckoff is explaining kind of what's going on in the community and the environment and the time period that they're in. He's personalizing the individuals who are these beginning investors. They are, the seamstress, the newspaper boy, the grocer, the policeman, as they're bringing it in. June, $101.5 million. July, estimated his net worth was over $8.5 million that he was bringing in. So the shop was set up simply. Upstairs, people would come in. There'd be a main waiting area. They'd be led to a couple of doors. There was the black cage with teller windows. They were bringing in money. They would get a handwritten, it's essentially on an index card, handwritten receipt, and a note that said, if you bring this back in this day, we will promise to pay you. And it was rubber stamped by Charles Ponzi. So, as he said, that they were as good as cash, as good as... The money was coming in so fast that they didn't have the opportunity to count it. It would go into baskets, and the record keeping was rudimentary at best. They at least wrote some of these things down. So that's the scheme. It afforded him the opportunity to spend money, bought a house in Lexington, Massachusetts for him and his wife. Handmade car called a locomobile, which a salesman had talked to about, which was custom made for an individual. He actually ended up spending more money to buy the car from somebody that had been promised to already. He enjoyed walking around with a diamond-headed walking stick, similar to J.P. Morgan, diamond pinned in his tie, finest clothes, a straw boater was his hat. So always dressed to the nines. And again, the whole idea behind this is setting the impression. It's somebody. It's a look. It's a feel. So if you look you're going to have, because a lot of this is based on reputation and on charisma. So he has all these things going, he's spending money, still trying to figure out a way to get out from this, because at some point in time he realizes this is probably not going to end too well unless I legitimize my businesses. As he's rolling in this cash, he decides, I'm going to try to go legitimate. He starts ending up buying shares of some banks. Hanover Trust was one bank that he had done a lot of business with, so he started buying shares of the bank. Went back to the company, J.R. Poole, that he had originally got the idea for figuring out how to trade foreign currencies from, decided to buy the bank, or buy the business from his old boss, who was kidding with him, you don't have that kind of money, and basically wrote him a check. And would deposit huge sums of money, so as he spread the money around in the community, the bankers would know who he was, and his reputation, because of the cash that he had on deposit, was continuing to increase. But he would spend money on buying shares of banks, buying real estate, trying to figure out a way to legitimize this business so he could figure out a way to get out of this. The scheme was going along very well in his mind, but it was causing him stress. There's an article, there's a chapter here that he talks about. The title of the chapter is, "But I'm Feeling It Now." Then it started not to go so good. So I don't think I'm going to spoil anything if I kind of tell. But Charlie Ponzi's dead, so you know. I mean, so if he was born, if he was born in 1882, he's not around anymore. But then the whole thing started to come apart. So in his telling of how this came apart, Zuckoff introduces this other character, Richard Grosier, at the same time. And Richard was the son of, what was his dad's name here? Edwin. Yes, thank you. Edwin Grosier. Very well respected for the Boston Post. Very well respected owner and publisher of the Boston Post. But also, coincidentally enough, had been sued for libel by Boston mayor at that time, Curley, which he won. But it set the tone for kind of how the newspapers were going to deal with something like this. Zuckoff kind of takes off on a tangent here a little bit and introduces the story of Richard Grosier, underachiever, high success family, kicked out of Harvard a number of times, working in the family business, trying to do a good job, trying to please his father. His father becomes ill and he's kind of thrust into the lead of this. And you realize that, so when he's introducing, it seems like they're out here, as this scheme starts to blow up on Ponzi, Richard Grosier plays a huge role, along with a couple of his star reporters, plays a huge role in kind of bringing this out to the public. So you would think, if this is going on, well, where are the regulators? And at that time, the Postal Commission couldn't really investigate him because it was a legitimate business. And whenever he was, because of his charisma, because of the way he presented himself, whenever somebody questioned it, he just kind of explained it in more of a grandiose manner rather than getting down to the details in terms of what he was doing. But he would never say, this is who I'm buying these from. This is the operational part, because that was his trade secret. So the Postmaster General really couldn't do anything with it. Calvin Coolidge, which I didn't know until the time, was the mayor of Boston at the time and was revered in Boston because he had kind of broke the Boston police strike, which was a huge deal in 1918, 1919. He appointed a banking commissioner, Joseph Allen, to kind of look into Ponzi. But the problem was that he wasn't really a bank. So he wasn't really able to get into investigating him. So where's the role in the newspaper in this? Ironically, the newspapers weren't really telling the story. as much as you would think. That, and today, you pick up the newspaper, newspapers are going to lay the story out. Back then, Zuckoff makes the point that newspapers operated under a little different premise. First off, they weren't looking at giving out free publicity. If you wanted publicity, you buy an ad. They also had a number of other things going on at that time. In 1919, you had women's suffrage, you had prohibition, you had Coolidge and the Boston Police Department strike, which was a huge deal. You had Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was at that time, he was a Red Stocking, not a Yankee. So he makes a point that they may not have completely understood it, but they had other things that they were writing on at that time. The Banking Commission, their hands were tied a little bit because it really wasn't a bank that he was operating. He was a lender, an investor, providing to pay people money. Grozier starts coming in, is reading a couple of articles and decides things don't seem to be the way that they're being reported. So he asks one of his star reporters, he said, do me a favor, if you wouldn't mind, start to take a look at this Charlie Ponzi guy and the business that he's got going on. Always knowing at that time that he's pushing the envelope, so to speak. He's kind of getting up to that line because he remembers what his father went through with Curly regarding the libel suit. So there's always the question of if you're wrong and you get sued, you're basically taking your father's newspaper that he spent his entire life building up, and you better be right with this idea. So he was pushing it a little bit, would write articles about it, but the ironic thing is he was writing these articles, it would actually cull more interest. People were lining up at the door, so much so as these articles were going around that he had to come up with another way to get people into the building because the alleyway that they were walking into was packed. So he would hire Pinkerton detectives, he would hire police officers in order to try and manage the masses. But every time an article came out from one of the newspapers, especially the Boston Post, it would spur business. It would spur business on. So Grozier decides what I'm going to do at this time. I'm going to find a financial expert. I'm going to find somebody, Clarence Behrens. So Clarence Behrens was a very well-respected financial journalist at the time. He had bought Dow Jones. He owned the Wall Street Journal. He owned Barron's paper at the time, very well-respected. And he would write articles that questioned whether or not it was a viable option. People would still come. People would still come. But this kind of beginning of the end at this point. And so the quickness of, as you're reading through this, the quickness of how things transpire picks up, as opposed to going from months to months. And Zuckoff is talking about the lead up to, starting from March through June, July, August, as he's reeling in, he's taking in $1 million a week towards the end. Now all of this starts to fall apart in about a 2-week period. So as quick as it had increased, as quick as the business had ramped up, the fall was as fast. There was a way for the bank investigator, Joseph Allen, in order to figure out a way to investigate him through his ownership of Hanover Trust Bank that he owned shares in. He was a major shareholder in that. Again, trying to go legitimate caused his downfall. So Zuckoff kind of changes the speed, and as I'm reading this, is going through, you can't, there's so many different pieces together, but I found it difficult to put it down at that point, because you're almost waiting for, I'm getting angst as I'm reading through this, figuring out what's going to happen, because there's a number of these things that are going on. He's made a deal with the Attorney General, the State Attorney General, in order not to take in any additional cash. So you would think that reading the newspaper articles and not taking in cash, people would continue to storm and ask for their money back. After about a week, that culled. People were still lining up. They wanted to give him money. They wanted to believe. They wanted to believe. They fear of missing out. They thought that he had discovered a way to make money. They wanted to believe this charismatic little Italian immigrant off the boat who was making it big in America, who had figured out a way to print money. And they wanted to believe it so bad. They wanted to believe it. So the newspapers really didn't do their job in terms of kind of saving the public until kind of the end. And it was really Grosier's newspaper that really led the charge at that. And then once that happened, then the federal authorities were able to step in. They closed things down. He admitted defeat. And I'm kind of glossing over it because I found the chapters leading up to those last 2 weeks very interesting in terms of what was going on. So it's not really a spoiler because you kind of know what's happening, but it's a very interesting read in terms of chronologically detailing what he's going through and the individuals that he's dealing with at that time. Because he's still trying to figure out a way to get out of this at some point until an auditor comes to him and says, you owe $7 million, you only have $4. So the victims, as I had talked about, Zuckoff really kind of personalizes the victims. The victims were a lot of his neighbors, a lot of people in Boston. He did open other shops in the Northeast, outside of the Boston area, but he focuses the conversation, he focuses the dialogue and the discussion on kind of those immigrants, those individuals who really want to believe, and still believed up until the end that Charlie Ponzi had an opportunity to make money and to kind of give them a better way of life. You know, if you're making $2,000 a year, but you can deposit $500 and in 45 days get $750, and then in 90 days get $1,000, they can really be life-changing in this environment where people were being bombarded all the time by medical scams, scams on turning seawater into gold, scams about a box that would print $100 bills, things like this. Zuckoff all makes these changes. So, so you would think that something like that, in hindsight, you look back and you go, oh, of course, how could people not be? In context, it still goes on in today's world. People are still, it's not a Ponzi scheme. It's not, and what's different from a Ponzi scheme from a pyramid scheme or a multi-level marketing scheme is that the higher-ups are getting paid by, the idea is you try and bring in as many people as you can, and they try and bring in more people. But we read about all the time about scams, and it tends to be the individuals who are the most vulnerable at the time, those who are developmentally disabled, those who are disabled, those who are elderly. In our business, every call from a national level talks about ways that you need to protect your elderly clients, things that you need to be aware of. And some of the things in terms of the fraud are crazy because people want to believe. People want to believe that there's a better opportunity, a better life out there. I found the writing style in terms of being an investigative journalist, his style was such that it was, and with the 55 pages of reference, it was very good in terms of providing kind of a dialogue, as though it were reading like fiction as you're going through it, but with the facts that are backing it up. These were pulled from these notes, these were pulled from these letters, these were pulled from conversations with individuals. So it was interesting to read in that it wasn't like reading a science text or a textbook like I was in school. It made it personal, it made it something a little bit easier to read. It made for good, quick reading. The other thing that I like about Zuckoff as he was wrapping this up is he got to the end, told the story, the whole thing blew up, and he has an epilogue. And the epilogue kind of ties some of these, what happened to Charlie after he went to prison? What happened to Rose, his wife? What happened, to some of these other people, what happened. And he does a very good job of kind of tying up what I consider some of these loose ends. I hate reading a book and I get to the end and I'm like, well, what about? So a very good story, very interesting read, something that, that occurs early 1900s, but still resonates today with respects to what's going on. And I realized I took longer than I should, yes.
What did happen to Rose?
What did happen to Rose?
Yeah.
Actually, Rose lived to a ripe old age, passed away in 1993.
Wow.
So Rose was another character that he did all of this for his mother and for Rose. Rose was somebody that he really wanted to impress. She was about 15 years younger than him. The lady he was rooming from taught music. Rose was a student of hers, introduced her. Rose stuck by him through the trials. Rose continued to be married to him while he was in jail, and then realized at some point that she did not want to be Rose Ponzi anymore, and then filed for divorce. When he was let out of prison, he was deported to Italy, spent some time there, tried to get a pardon, asked Mussolini for some leniency, which I thought was a little interesting, now knowing. But they would still correspond quite a bit. In fact, Zuckoff is the first thank you, references the Gnecco family, Rose's family, because apparently she saved all his correspondence. So he was still writing to her while he was in Brazil, as he was essentially dying in a pauper's hospital. And she went on to live until 1993, so it wasn't that long ago. And I think Calvin Coolidge became president. So. Yes.
How about his mother? When did she pass?
So during this important time, he was interested. She passed in a period where he was going through, where he was being charged and he was going in prison. There was a time where he was raising this money that he had bought tickets to take him and Rose back to Italy to visit his mother and bring her back. He realized that visually may not look the best, to take in all this money and then to skip town. So he actually brought her over. And she was here in their house in Lexington with him for a number of years. When things started to go, she passed away when he was in prison, and they would not allow him to go see her before she passed away.